I'm Lina Chen, 68, and for 30 years I poured my heart, my savings, and my soul into raising my children after their father left us with nothing. I worked 3 jobs, paid for their college, helped with their down payments, and even funded my son's failed restaurant. Last month, they sat me down with glossy brochures and gentle voices, explaining how Sunset Manor would be perfect for me. They said it was temporary, just until I got stronger. But, as I watched them dividing up my furniture and discussing my house like I was already gone, I realized the truth. They saw me as a burden to be managed, not a mother to be honored. What they don't know is that I've spent 40 years learning exactly how to make people pay attention. And sometimes, the quietest revolution is the most devastating one. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt invisible to the people you've sacrificed everything for, this story is for you. Like this video for more stories of truth, justice, and reclaiming your power. The divorce papers from 1985 are still in my bedroom drawer, yellowed with age but crisp with the memory of betrayal. I can still feel the weight of them in my hands that March morning when Robert walked out, leaving me with 3 children under 10 and a mortgage I couldn't afford on my secretary's salary. David was 9, always asking when Daddy was coming home. Sarah was 7, crying herself to sleep most nights. Jennifer, my baby, was only 5 and kept setting a place for him at dinner. I stopped correcting her after the first month. Hope dies hard in children, and I wasn't ready to be the one to kill it completely. Those papers represented more than the end of my marriage. They were the beginning of a promise I made to myself in the courthouse bathroom, tears streaming down my face as I gripped the sink. My children would never want for anything I could provide. They would go to college, have opportunities. No, they were loved unconditionally. I would be both mother and father, provider and nurturer, no matter what it cost me. The first job was at Peterson & Associates, answering phones and filing. The second was cleaning offices downtown 3 nights a week. The third was weekend catering gigs when I could find them. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My hands grew rough from cleaning chemicals. My back ached from standing, but every dollar went toward their future. I remember the morning David asked why I was always so tired. He was 12 then, old enough to notice the dark circles under my eyes, the way I moved slower than other mothers. I told him I was working hard so he could have everything he needed. He hugged me, then really hugged me on, said he'd make me proud someday. That memory still makes my chest tight, because he did make me proud, at least in the beginning. They all did. Honor roll students, college graduates, successful careers. I thought I had kept my promise. I thought the sacrifice had been worth it. But sitting in that sterile nursing home room, holding those same divorce papers I'd kept all these years, I realized something devastating. The children I'd raised to never want for anything had grown into adults who wanted everything, including my dignity, my independence, my very existence, to be convenient for them. The irony wasn't lost on me. Robert had abandoned us when we needed him most. Now our children were doing the same to me, just with better marketing and a monthly fee structure. The only difference was that this time, I wasn't the naive young woman who would cry in bathroom stalls. This time, I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I had decades of experience in making impossible situations work in my favor. The college tuition receipts tell the story better than I ever could, hundreds of them, filed chronologically, in a manila folder marked their future. Each one represents nights I went without dinner, birthdays I celebrated with dollar store decorations, vacations that never happened because every spare penny went toward their education. David was first. Accepted to State University for engineering. I remember the day the financial aid letter arrived, not nearly enough to cover his expenses. I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and 3 different part-time job applications, figuring out how to make the impossible math work. The catering company needed weekend help. The department store was hiring seasonal workers. I took both jobs and told David not to worry about money, just focus on his studies. I wore the same winter coat for 8 years during his college tenure, the same pair of work shoes until the sole separated completely from the leather. My coworkers at Peterson & Associates started a secret collection to buy me lunch when they realized I was skipping meals. I was mortified but grateful. Their kindness meant I could put that lunch money toward David's textbook fund. Sarah's acceptance to the state university's business program came with even less financial aid. By then, I was working for original secretary position, weekend catering, evening office cleaning, and holiday retail. My days started at 6 in the morning and ended near midnight. I lived on coffee and determination, telling myself it was temporary, that once they graduated and found good jobs, I could finally rest. Jennifer's admission to the same university for her education degree meant 3 kids in college simultaneously for 2 years. I took out a second mortgage on the house Robert had signed over to me in the divorce. Probably thinking it was more burden than asset, I proved him wrong by leveraging every dollar of equity for their education. The pride I felt watching them walk across that stage, one by one, made every sacrifice worthwhile. David in his engineering cap and gown, Sarah with her business degree and job offer already in hand, Jennifer beaming as she accepted her teaching credential. I sat in those auditorium seats wearing my best dress, which was actually my only dress that still fit properly and felt like the richest woman in the world. They were grateful then, or seemed to be. David sent me flowers on Mother's Day with cards that said thank you for everything. Sarah called every Sunday to check on me. Jennifer brought her new boyfriend over for dinner, proudly introducing me as the strongest woman she knew. But gratitude, I've learned, has a shelf life. It spoils when mixed with entitlement and time. Those same children who once hugged me, tight and promised to take care of me when I got older, began to see my sacrifices not as gifts of love, but as debts they never asked to owe. The foundation I'd built for their dreams became the very thing they'd later use to justify putting me away. The business loan documents are still in my safe deposit box, $50,000 that changed everything between David and me. His signature next to mine on the cosigner line, my retirement savings pledged as collateral for his dream of owning Chen's Kitchen, the fusion restaurant that would make our family name famous. David was 32 then, 5 years into his engineering career but restless with corporate life. He'd started cooking as a hobby, posting photos of elaborate meals on social media, talking about recipes that honored our Chinese heritage while appealing to American palates. His passion was infectious. I watched him describe his business plan with more enthusiasm than I'd seen since his college graduation. "Mom, this is it," he said, spreading papers across my dining room table. "Food service is booming. Asian fusion is trending. I've got the location picked out, experienced staff ready to hire, a marketing strategy that'll put us on the map within 6 months." The numbers looked impressive to my untrained eye. Projected revenues, cost analyses, market research about the growing appetite for authentic ethnic cuisine. He'd clearly put thought into this. Unlike his previous ventures, the online t-shirt business that lasted 3 months, the cryptocurrency investment that disappeared overnight. But $50,000 was everything I had left after putting 3 kids through college. My retirement account, finally starting to recover after years of minimal contributions. The safety net I'd never had as a young single mother, now within reach of a comfortable older age. "I know it's a lot to ask," David continued, his voice taking on that pleading tone I remembered from childhood, "but banks won't approve me without a cosigner. My credit took a hit with those student loans and the startup costs for the other businesses. You're the only person I trust enough to ask." The word trust did it. After everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd provided, my son trusted me with his dreams. How could I say no to that? I should have listened to my instincts instead of my heart. The restaurant opened with great fanfare, local food bloggers, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, David beaming in his chef's coat as customers filled every table that first week. I was so proud, telling everyone at work about my son, the rest secretly hoping this success would finally prove to Robert, wherever he was, that I'd raised remarkable children despite his abandonment. The decline was swift and brutal. Poor location. Despite David's research, foot traffic dried up after the initial curiosity. Inventory management disasters that led to massive food waste. Staff turnover that created service inconsistencies. Within 8 months, Chen's Kitchen was hemorrhaging money faster than David could make excuses. "It's the economy, Mom. Small businesses are struggling everywhere. The suppliers are gouging us. These wholesale prices are impossible. We just need another month to turn things around. The new marketing campaign is going to change everything." Each excuse came with a request for more money. Not loans, investments in our family's future. Just enough to cover rent, to pay staff, to stock inventory for the busy season that never came. I watched my retirement savings disappear, $50, $100, $500 at a time, until the account that had taken me decades to build was completely empty. When kitchen finally closed, David showed up at my door with red eyes and a folder full of bills. For a moment, I thought he was coming to apologize, to acknowledge what his dream had cost us both. Instead, he sat at my kitchen table and explained why the failure wasn't really his fault, how I hadn't provided enough initial capital, how my hesitation to invest more had created cash flow problems, how my lack of business experience had made me a poor advisor. That was the moment I realized I'd raised a stranger. The bank withdrawal slips paint a picture of systematic depletion, my life's work reduced to a series of five-figure transactions, each one justified by another milestone in my children's lives that somehow required my financial participation. Sarah's house hunting began 2 years after David's restaurant failure, when I was still recovering from that financial disaster. She'd been renting a cramped apartment with her husband Mike, saving for a down payment that never seemed large enough for the homes they wanted in their preferred neighborhood. "Mom, we found the perfect place," she called to tell me, her voice bright with excitement. "It's a 4-bedroom colonial with a gorgeous kitchen and a backyard for the kids we're planning. But we need another $15,000 for the down payment to avoid PMI. Could you help us out? We'll pay you back once Mike gets his promotion." $15,000, the exact amount I'd managed to rebuild in my retirement accounts since David's restaurant fiasco. I stared at my bank statement, feeling that familiar tug between my children's happiness and my own security. "Sarah, honey, I just don't have that kind of money right now, Mom. Please. This house won't last on the market. It's exactly what we need to start our family. And you know Mike's promotion is practically guaranteed. We're not asking for a gift. This is a loan. We'll have it back to you within 2 years." The promotion never materialized. Mike's company downsized 6 months later, and he took a lower-paying position with a different firm. The loan became an indefinite family obligation, mentioned awkwardly at holiday dinners but never seriously addressed. Sarah began referring to my investment in their future rather than acknowledging it as money I'd never see again. Jennifer's wedding plans arrived like a hurricane the following year. She'd fallen in love with Marcus, a decent man who worked in tech support, and they wanted to celebrate with what she called the wedding of our dreams. "I've been dreaming of this day since I was little, Mom. Remember how we used to look at wedding magazines together? You always said every girl deserves to feel like a princess on her wedding day." The venue she'd chosen cost more than I'd made in 6 months at any of my multiple jobs. The dress required alterations that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The flowers, the photographer, the band, the rehearsal dinner, each element came with a price tag that made my head spin. "I know it's expensive," Jennifer said, tears in her eyes as we reviewed the budget she'd prepared. "But Marcus's family doesn't have much, and his parents can barely cover their portion. I don't want to start our marriage going into debt. You're the only one who can help us have the wedding we really want." $28,000. Every penny I had left, plus a personal loan I had to take against my house. I told myself it was an investment in her happiness, that watching my youngest daughter walk down the aisle in her dream dress would be worth the financial stress. The wedding was beautiful. Jennifer glowed in her designer gown. The venue was elegantly decorated. The band kept everyone dancing until midnight. I sat at the mother-of-a-bride table in my department, stored dressed the only formal wear I could afford after paying for everything else, and watched my daughter's perfect day unfold. But the gratitude I expected never came. Instead, Jennifer seemed to take the elaborate celebration as evidence of what I could provide when properly motivated. Within months, she was calling with requests for help with furniture for their new apartment, contributions to Marcus's student loan payments, money for a honeymoon they'd had to postpone due to unexpected expenses. I finally understood what I'd created: 3 adult children who saw me not as a person with my own needs and limitations, but as an ATM with unlimited funds and unconditional availability. Every sacrifice I'd made in love had taught them that my resources, financial and emotional, exist solely for their benefit. The withdrawal slips tell the truth. My heart didn't want to acknowledge I'd spent 30 years teaching my children that my love could be measured in dollars. And they'd learned that lesson perfectly. The hospital discharge papers from that October morning tell a different story than the one my children created. Patient experienced mild chest pains, likely due to stress and fatigue, EKG normal, blood work within acceptable ranges. Recommend rest and follow up with primary care physician in 2 weeks. Mild chest pains, not a heart attack, not a cardiac event, not the life-threatening emergency my children would later describe to justify their actions, just my body's way of telling me that working 2 jobs at 67, while supporting 3 adult children had finally caught up with me. I'd been cleaning Mrs. Patterson's house when the tightness started in my chest, sharp enough to make me sit down, persistent enough to worry me. I'd driven myself to the emergency room, something I'd later regret admitting to my children, as it became evidence of my dangerous independence and poor judgment. David arrived first, still in his work clothes, looking genuinely frightened. For a moment, I felt that old warmth, the love between mother and son that had sustained me through decades of sacrifice. He held my hand while we waited for the doctor, asked thoughtful questions about my symptoms, promised to help me figure out what was causing so much stress in my life. Sarah and Jennifer arrived together, both tearful and worried. Jennifer kept saying, "Mom, you scared us so much. We can't lose you." Sarah was already on her phone, canceling my cleaning appointments for the week, insisting I needed complete rest. Dr. Martinez was thorough and reassuring. The tests showed no heart damage, no blockages, no immediate concerns. "Mrs. Chen, your heart is actually in remarkably good shape for someone your age. This appears to be your body's response to prolonged stress. Are you dealing with any unusual pressures right now?" I could have mentioned David's continued requests for money, Sarah's assumption that I'd help with their mounting credit card debt, Jennifer's hints about needing help with a new car payment. I could have talked about working 2 physically demanding jobs to maintain the lifestyle I'd created around supporting them. Instead, I smiled and said I'd been working too hard lately. The children exchanged glances I didn't understand at the time. Later, I'd realized that look was them recognizing an opportunity. "Mom," David said as I was getting dressed to leave, "maybe this is a sign that you need to slow down. You're pushing yourself too hard, taking on too much responsibility. You live alone in that big house," Sarah added. "What if this had happened at home? What if you couldn't get to the phone?" Jennifer nodded earnestly. "We've been worried about you for months. You're trying to maintain the same pace you had 20 years ago, but you're not 20 years younger." Their concern felt genuine, and I was touched by their attention. After years of feeling like an afterthought in their busy lives, having all 3 children focused on my well-being was almost intoxicating. I let them drive me home, accepted their insistence on staying the night, agreed when they suggested I take a few weeks off from my cleaning jobs. What I didn't realize was that they'd already started researching nursing homes before I was even discharged. While I was sleeping off the stress and mild sedatives, they were calling assisted living facilities, gathering brochures, calculating costs. My minor health scare had become their major opportunity to solve what they'd apparently decided was the problem of my independence. The discharge papers were clearest: reduce stress, follow up in 2 weeks. Nothing about being incapable of living alone, nothing about needing supervised care, nothing about being a danger to myself or others. But paper trails, I've learned, can be rewritten by people who need them to tell a different story. The Sunset Manor price list that I found tucked behind Sarah's insurance papers told me everything I needed to know about my children's concern for my well-being. $4,700 per month for basic care, with additional fees for medications management, physical therapy, and what they euphemistically called life enrichment activities. I'd gone to Sarah's house that Tuesday to return the casserole dish from Sunday dinner, using the key she'd given me years ago for emergencies. The house was empty. She and Mike were both at work, but I noticed papers scattered across their dining room table in a way that seemed hurried, like someone had been interrupted while organizing. My name was on several documents: Sunset Manor's admission packet, partially completed, a comparison chart of 3 different facilities, with monthly costs highlighted in yellow. Most damning of all, a handwritten note in Sarah's precise script: Mom's house estimated value, $340,000 after sale. Monthly facility costs covered for approximately 6 years, remaining assets to be distributed per estate planning discussion. 6 years, they'd calculated how long my money would last to pay for my imprisonment. I stood in Sarah's dining room, holding that price list, feeling something cold settle in my chest, different from the stress-related tightness that had sent me to the hospital. This was the chill of recognition, the moment when you realized the people you've loved most in the world have been planning your disposal like a business transaction. The math was actually quite sophisticated. They'd researched my Social Security benefits, estimated my Medicare coverage, calculated the gap that would need to be covered by my assets. They'd even looked into Medicaid qualification requirements, should my money run out sooner than projected. The level of detail suggested this wasn't a recent conversation sparked by my hospital visit. This was a plan they'd been developing for some time. I photographed everything with my phone before carefully replacing the papers exactly as I'd found them. Evidence. I was already thinking, though I wasn't sure yet what I planned to do with it. That evening, I called each of my children separately. Casual conversations about their days, their plans for the weekend, their thoughts about the upcoming holidays. Not one of them mentioned nursing homes, assisted living, or concerns about my living situation. They talked about work stress, their marriages, their financial pressures. David mentioned needing new tires for his car but not having the cash until his next paycheck. Sarah complained about Mike's overtime being cut and how tight things were getting with the mortgage payment. Jennifer worried about Marcus's student loans and how they'd ever be able to afford the house they wanted. All of them poor-mouthed while planning to spend my money on removing me from their lives. I started doing my own research that week. I learned that assisted living facilities often require families to sign financial responsibility agreements. I discovered that once someone is placed in care, it's remarkably difficult to leave without family support. I read about elder abuse, not just physical, but financial and emotional manipulation by family members, who justify their actions as being in the best interest of their elderly relatives. Most importantly, I learned about my rights. As a competent adult with no legal guardianship restrictions, no one could force me into a care facility without my consent. My hospital scare hadn't changed my legal status or mental capacity. Any power of attorney arrangements would require my signature and could be revoked at any time. The price list had revealed their timeline. They planned to move quickly, probably within the month, while they could still claim my hospital visit as evidence of my declining health and judgment. What they didn't know was that their research had inadvertently provided me with everything I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting against. Knowledge, I've always believed, is the most powerful weapon in any battle. And now I knew exactly what war my children had declared on me. The power of attorney documents were already printed and waiting when I arrived at David's house for what I'd been told was a casual Sunday dinner. 3 copies, neatly stacked beside a pen, my name highlighted in yellow wherever my signature was required. They'd done their homework: medical, financial, and general powers of attorney, comprehensive enough to control every aspect of my life. "Mom, we need to talk," David said, his tone serious as he guided me to the living room, where Sarah and Jennifer were already seated. The formal arrangement of chairs, me facing the 3 of them, should have been my first clue that this wasn't a conversation but an intervention. Sarah held a folder thick with papers. Jennifer had her phone out, ready to take notes or make calls. David positioned himself closest to me, the son taking charge, the man of the family stepping up to handle the difficult situation. They'd clearly rehearsed this. "We've been doing a lot of thinking since your hospital scare," Sarah began, her voice gentle but determined. "We're worried about you living alone in that big house, managing everything by yourself. What if something happens and no one's there to help? The stress of maintaining that house, working those jobs, handling all your finances, it's too much for someone your age," Jennifer added. "We love you too much to watch you wear yourself down to nothing." David leaned forward, taking my hands in his. "We found a beautiful place called Sunset Manor. It's not a nursing home, Mom, it's assisted living. You'd have your own apartment, your meals prepared, activities and social opportunities, medical staff available 24 hours a day. You'd be safe and cared for." I looked at each of their faces, seeing the rehearsed concern, the coordinated presentation, the subtle pressure building toward an inevitable conclusion. "And if I don't want to go?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat. "Mom, we've talked to your doctor. He agrees that the stress of independent living contributed to your chest pains. Continuing to live alone could put your health at serious risk, which is why we need you to sign these," David said, sliding the power of attorney documents toward me, "just as a precaution, so we can help manage things if you have another health episode. It doesn't change anything day to day, just means we can take care of business if you're unable to." I picked up the papers, scanning the dense legal language that would give my children complete control over my medical decisions, my finances, my living situation. Every major choice in my life would become theirs to make. This seems like a lot more than a precaution. It's standard, Jennifer said quickly. Everyone our age has power of attorney for their parents. It's just being responsible. And the nursing home, assisted living, Sarah corrected. We've already put down a deposit to hold a spot. The waiting list is usually months long, but they had a cancellation. If we don't move quickly, you'll lose the opportunity. There it was, the artificial urgency, the manufactured crisis, the illusion of choice where only one option was actually available. Sign the papers and accept their solution, or be labeled stubborn, difficult, a danger to myself. I set the documents down without signing them. I need time to think about this. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. David's jaw tightened. Sarah exchanged a look with Jennifer that I recognized from their childhood, the moment when they realized I wasn't going to cooperate with their plans. Mom, David said, his patience clearly strained, this isn't really a decision you can put off. Your health, your safety, these aren't things we can gamble with because you're being sentimental about a house. Sentimental. The word stung more than I expected. That house is my home. It's where I raised you, where you're isolated and struggling. Sarah interrupted. Mom, we see how hard it is for you. The cleaning jobs that exhaust you, the bills you can barely manage, the loneliness. We're offering you a better life, controlled by them, funded by my money, designed around their convenience. I looked at the power of attorney papers again, understanding finally that this conversation was never about my well-being. It was about removing the burden of an aging parent while gaining access to whatever assets I had left. I'm not signing anything today, I said, standing up, and I'm not moving anywhere until I've had time to consider all my options. The mask slipped then. David's face flushed with frustration. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The stress, the hospital visitor not making rational decisions. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I replied, heading toward the door. And what I'm thinking is that my competent, adult children seem to have forgotten that I'm also a competent adult. I left the power of attorney papers on David's coffee table, unsigned. What I took with me was the absolute certainty that I was no longer fighting for my independence. I was fighting for my life. The room assignment letter arrived 3 days after I refused to sign the power of attorney documents. Welcome to Sunset Manor. You have been assigned to room 247B. Your move-in date is scheduled for November 15th. I stared at the letter, realizing my children had proceeded with their plans regardless of my objections. I called David immediately. I never agreed to this. Mom, we talked about this. You're not safe living alone anymore. We've already paid the deposit, arranged for movers, notified your landlord. I'm not a renter, David. That's my house. I own it. Not for much longer, he said, and something in his tone made my blood freeze. We're listing it next week. The market's good right now, and you'll need the money for your care. They were selling my house. Without my permission, without my signature, apparently confident that once I was installed at Sunset Manor, I'd have no choice but to cooperate with their financial arrangements. The morning of November 15th, they arrived with forced cheerfulness and a moving truck. Sarah brought coffee and pastries, as if this were a celebration rather than a kidnapping. Jennifer had prepared a photo album of family memories to make my new room feel like home. David supervised the movers with military efficiency, directing them to take only what would fit in a studio apartment and leave the rest for donation or disposal. Mom, you don't need all this stuff, Sarah said, watching me protest as they packed away photo albums, Robert's old books, the china set I'd saved for special occasions that never came. Sunset Manor provides everything you need. Too many personal belongings just create clutter in small spaces. I watched 30 years of my life reduced to a few boxes and 2 suitcases. The dining room table where I'd helped them with homework, sold to a stranger. The couch where we'd watched countless movies together, donated to charity. The kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals with love and exhaustion, emptied of everything that made it mine. This is temporary, right? I asked as we loaded the last box into David's car. Just until I get stronger. Of course, Mom, Jennifer said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Just until you're feeling better. Room 247B was exactly what I expected. Clean, sterile, institutional, a hospital bed, a small dresser, a single chair by the window that looked out on the parking lot. The bathroom was designed for elderly invalids, with grab bars and a shower chair that I didn't need. The closet was barely large enough for the clothes they'd allowed me to bring. My new neighbors came to introduce themselves during that first awful afternoon. Mrs. Rodriguez from 247A had been placed there by her son after a minor fall. Just temporary, she said with bitter irony, until I recover. That was 18 months ago. Mr. Peterson from across the hall had been moved by his daughter after his wife died. She said I was too depressed to live alone safely. Apparently, grief is now a medical condition requiring supervision. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Adult children who'd reframed normal aging processes as incompetence requiring intervention, families who'd found in assisted living facilities a socially acceptable way to warehouse parents who'd become inconvenient. That first night, I lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of institutional living call buttons chiming, staff conversing in the hallways, the television from the common room playing too loudly for residents who were hard of hearing. Everything smelled like disinfectant and industrial food. The window didn't open, and the thermostat was controlled by the nursing station. I thought about my empty house, probably already staged for sale with generic furniture and neutral paint. I thought about my children, probably celebrating their successful intervention with dinner at some nice restaurant they could now afford more easily, without supporting their aging mother. Most of all, I thought about the room assignment letter, with its cheerful welcome, and its assumption of my compliance. Someone had signed the admission papers in my absence. Someone had authorized the monthly payments from my bank account. Someone had made decisions about my life without consulting me at all. I'd spent decades teaching my children that family takes care of family, that love means sacrifice, that parents exist to smooth the path for their children's success. Lying in that institutional bed, I realized they'd learned those lessons perfectly. They'd just decided I was no longer family, just an obligation to be managed as efficiently as possible. The room assignment letter became my declaration of war. Room 247B would not be my final address. The Sunset Manor Resident Handbook was 127 pages of rules, regulations, and restrictions disguised as helpful information about maximizing your assisted living experience. I read every word during my first week, understanding that knowledge of the system would be essential to escaping it. Visiting hours, 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., with overnight guests requiring 48-hour advance approval. Medical appointments must be scheduled through the facility coordinator, with family notification required for all specialist visits. Financial matters, monthly statements provided to designated family contact, with residents encouraged to involve family members in all financial decisions. The handbook made it clear that while residents weren't prisoners, we also weren't entirely free. Every policy was designed around the assumption that we were incapable of making sound decisions about our own lives. The language was respectful and caring. But the reality was institutional control, wrapped in the rhetoric of safety and concern. I learned the daily routine quickly. Breakfast at 7:30, medications distributed at 8, morning activities starting at 9, physical therapy for those who needed it, craft time for those who wanted it, television for everyone else, lunch at noon, rest period until 2, afternoon activities until dinner at 5:30, evening entertainment bingo, movies, musical, performances by local school groups until lights out at 10. It was a life designed by committee, every hour accounted for, every choice made by someone else. Residents who'd once run businesses, raised families, managed complex lives, were reduced to following a schedule created for the convenience of staff and the peace of mind of distant relatives. But within that structure, I began to understand the informal power dynamics that really governed Sunset Manor. Mrs. Chen, no relation. Despite the shared surname, had been there 3 years and functioned as the unofficial resident advocate. She knew which staff members would bend rules, which families still visited regularly, and which residents had maintained control over their finances. "Your children moved fast," she observed during my second week, as we sat in the common area pretending to watch the morning news. "Most families take months to coordinate something like this. Yours had everything arranged in advance." "They'd been planning it for a while," I admitted. "Financial power of attorney. They tried. I didn't sign." Her eyebrows rose. "Smart woman. Most people here signed those papers years ago, thinking they were just being prepared. Then they discover their children have been making decisions without consulting them. She introduced me to others who'd maintained some legal independence. Mr. Garrett, whose daughter had tried to have him declared incompetent after he refused to sell his farm. Mrs. Williams, who'd hired her own lawyer when her son attempted to transfer her assets to his name. These residents moved differently through the facility, less defeated, more strategic, still fighting battles their families thought were over. The key, Mrs. Chen explained, is understanding that this place operates on the assumption that families know what's best. Staff members see us as children whose real parents are our adult kids. They don't challenge family decisions unless there's obvious abuse or neglect. I learned which staff members were allies and which were simply following protocol. Nurse Patricia had placed her own mother in assisted living and understood the complexity of family dynamics. She was willing to help residents maintain connections to the outside world, making phone calls, arranging private meetings, providing information about legal resources. Activity Director James was young and idealistic, still believing that elderly people deserved dignity and choice. He'd been known to arrange unauthorized outings for residents whose families had restricted their mobility. But Administrator Reynolds was firmly committed to avoiding any conflict with family members. His job was to keep residents safe, families satisfied, and the facility profitable. Independent-minded residents who questioned their placement were problems to be managed, not people to be empowered. Within 2 weeks, I'd mapped the entire system, formal and informal, official and underground. I understood which battles could be fought publicly and which required subterfuge. I identified potential allies among staff and residents, and I began to see how someone with determination and strategic thinking could work within the system while planning to escape it. The handbook had intended to orient me to a life of managed decline. Instead, it became my blueprint for resistance. Every rule they'd written to control me became information I could use to outmaneuver them. Room 247B might be my current address, but I was already planning my change of residence. The property tax assessment for my house arrived in my mail 3 weeks after I'd been installed at Sunset Manor. The envelope was addressed to me at room 247B. Apparently my children had been efficient enough to forward my mail, but careless enough not to intercept the documents that would reveal their true intentions. $340,000. The assessed value was exactly what I'd seen written in Sarah's handwriting on her dining room table. But more shocking was the notation at the bottom. Property tax bill forwarded to new address per owner request, dated November 10th. November 10th was 5 days before they'd moved me to Sunset Manor. They'd been so confident in their plan that they'd changed my address before I'd even agreed to the move. I called the assessor's office from the phone in the common area, keeping my voice low as other residents watched their morning television programs. "I'm calling about the property at 1247 Maple Street," I told the clerk. "I'm the owner, but I'm confused about some recent changes to the mailing address." "Oh yes, Mrs. Chen, your son David called about that. He said you'd been moved to assisted living and wanted all property correspondence sent to your new address. He also inquired about the process for transferring ownership. Very thoughtful of him to handle those details for you." My hands tightened. On the phone, what exactly did he ask about transferring ownership? The standard procedure: power of attorney documentation, competency assessments if needed, tax implications of family transfers. He seemed very well informed about the process. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. David hadn't just researched assisted living facilities, he'd researched how to legally steal my house. That afternoon, I asked Nurse Patricia if I could use the office computer to check my email. What I found there made my chest tight with the same stress-related pain that had started this entire nightmare. An email from David to a real estate agent. "Thank you for the market analysis on 1247 Maple Street. We're planning to list within the next 60 days, once we've completed the necessary legal arrangements. As discussed, we'll need a quick sale since the property will be funding our mother's care costs." An email from Sarah to her bank, following up on our conversation about the home equity loan. "Once the property sells, we'll be able to pay off the remaining balance and use the equity for Mom's facility costs and our own debt consolidation." An email from Jennifer to someone named Rebecca. "You asked about how we're handling Mom's situation. It's been stressful but necessary. The house sale should cover her care for several years, and honestly, it's a relief to know she's somewhere safe. We can focus on our own families now without constantly worrying about her." Each email was a knife twist, but the last one was the deepest cut. My youngest daughter, the one I'd protected most carefully, the one whose wedding had cost me my savings, was relieved to be rid of me. I printed everything before logging out, my hands shaking as I folded the papers into my purse. Evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and something that felt like a kind of murder, the systematic killing of who I'd been as an independent person. But the emails had also revealed something they probably hadn't intended. They were in serious financial trouble. David's business was failing again. Sarah and Mike were drowning in debt. Jennifer and Marcus were barely making ends meet. My house wasn't just convenient to liquidate, it was essential to their financial survival. They needed me gone, not just for my convenience, but for theirs. Every month I stayed in assisted living was a month they could delay their own financial reckonings. My care costs were their wealth preservation strategy. Walking back to room 247B, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: power. They'd made a critical mistake in underestimating me, in assuming that being old meant being helpless, that being their mother meant being their victim. The property tax assessment became my call to arms. They wanted to treat me like a commodity to be liquidated. I'd show them exactly how much this particular asset was worth on the open market of family loyalty. The financial statements arrived in my room like clockwork every month, but I'd never paid attention to the details until I realized they were evidence of theft. My December statement showed transactions I'd never authorized: automatic payments to Sunset Manor, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, and a disturbing pattern of daily ATM withdrawals that I certainly hadn't made. Someone had been using my debit card. Someone had access to my online banking. Someone had been systematically draining my checking account while I focused on the larger betrayal of my placement here. I called my bank from the privacy of my room during the evening quiet hours when most residents were in the common area watching television. I'm reviewing my December statement, and I see several transactions I didn't authorize. I told the customer service representative, "Let me pull up your account. Mrs. Chen, I see you have 3 authorized users on this account: David Chen, Sarah Peterson, and Jennifer Martinez. All 3 were added in September with your verbal authorization. September, 2 months before my hospital visit, 3 months before they moved me here. They'd been planning this financial takeover long before they had any medical justification for concern about my competency. I don't remember authorizing anyone to access my account. I have a recorded phone call from September 15th, where you confirmed adding your children as authorized users for emergency purposes. Would you like me to replay that conversation?" My heart sank. I did remember that Sarah had convinced me it was just a safety measure in case something happened to me. She'd presented it as a way for them to help pay my bills if I was ever hospitalized or unable to manage my finances temporarily. I'd been so touched by their apparent concern that I'd agreed without reading the fine print. What exactly can authorized users do? They have full access to checking and savings accounts, can make withdrawals, transfer funds, and set up automatic payments. Essentially the same privileges as the primary account holder. Full access. No wonder they'd been confident about proceeding with their plans without my power of attorney signature. They'd already secured legal control over my money. Can I remove the authorized users? Absolutely. You can do that online, by phone, or in person, at any branch. You'll need to provide identification and answer security questions. I spent the next hour on the phone, removing my children's access to my accounts and setting up new security measures. I changed my PIN, my online banking password, and added a verbal security code that would be required for any future account changes. Then I began the real detective work. I printed out 6 months of bank statements and credit card bills, spreading them across my small table to create a timeline of my financial exploitation. The pattern was methodical and sophisticated. Small amounts, initially $20 here, 50 there amounts I might not notice or might attribute to my own forgetfulness. Then larger withdrawals, as they tested whether I was paying attention. Finally, the systematic draining that had accelerated after my hospital visit. David had been the most aggressive, using my card for gas, groceries, and what appeared to be business expenses. Sarah had been more subtle, transferring money to cover her mortgage payments and credit card bills. Jennifer had been the most emotional manipulator, taking money for emergencies that I later realized were routine expenses she didn't want to handle herself. Together, they'd stolen over $15,000 in 4 months. Money I'd earned through decades of hard work. Money I'd saved by denying myself small luxuries. Money I'd planned to use for my own care as I aged. But the financial statements revealed something else. I still had more assets than they'd probably realized. My 401k from Peterson and Associates, barely touched because I'd been too busy supporting them to retire. A small insurance policy that had been paying premiums automatically for years. A savings account at a different bank that I'd opened years ago and forgotten about. I wasn't as financially vulnerable as they'd assumed. More importantly, I now had documentation of their theft, evidence of their systematic exploitation, and proof that their concern for my welfare was motivated by their own financial desperation. The statements became my battle plan. Every unauthorized transaction was ammunition. Every forged signature was evidence. Every lie they'd told about acting in my best interest was contradicted by the cold mathematics of their greed. They'd wanted to control my money to pay for my imprisonment. Instead, they'd given me exactly what I needed to purchase my freedom. The lawyer's business card sat in my purse for 3 days before I found the courage to call Margaret Williamson, elder law attorney. With an office just 2 miles from Sunset Manor, Mrs. Chen had recommended her. She's helped several residents here get out of situations they didn't choose to be in. I arranged the appointment for a Thursday afternoon, during the facility's mandatory rest period when my absence would be less noticeable. I told the front desk I was going to physical therapy at the medical center next door. A lie that came easier than I expected. Margaret Williamson was younger than I'd anticipated, maybe 45, with sharp eyes and a handshake that conveyed both competence and compassion. Her office was decorated with family photos, her own children, I assumed, and certificates that spoke to her expertise in elder law, estate planning, and financial abuse cases. "Mrs. Chen, tell me about your situation," she said, settling behind her desk with a legal pad ready for notes. I'd rehearsed this conversation, but sitting across from someone who might actually be able to help me made the words tumble out in a rush. The hospital visit, the manipulation, the unauthorized access to my accounts, the placement at Sunset Manor against my will, the planned sale of my house without my consent. She listened without interruption, taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, she sat back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Chen, what you're describing is elder financial abuse, which is a crime in this state. The unauthorized use of your bank accounts, the manipulation to gain access to your finances, the placement in assisted living for their financial benefit rather than your medical needs. These are all actionable offenses." "But I'm not incompetent," I said. "I can prove I don't need to be there." "That's exactly the point. Competent adults cannot be forced into care facilities against their will. The fact that you're here without having been declared incompetent by a court suggests your children may have committed fraud in the admission process." She pulled out a form and began writing. "I'm going to need copies of everything you've brought, me the financial statements, the emails, the property tax assessment. We'll also need to request your complete medical records from the hospital and from Sunset Manor to document that there's no medical justification for your current placement." "Can I just leave, walk out today?" "Legally, yes, but practically, it's more complicated. If you leave without a plan, your children can argue that you're acting irrationally, that you're putting yourself in danger, that you need emergency intervention. We need to be strategic about this." She outlined a plan that was both legally sound and tactically smart. First, we'd establish my competency through a formal evaluation by a geriatric psychiatrist. Then we'd secure my financial accounts and reverse any unauthorized transactions. Finally, we'd address my living situation by demonstrating that I was capable of independent living with appropriate supports. "The key," she explained, "is showing that you were manipulated into this situation through lies and financial coercion, not that you're rebelling against legitimate concerns about your welfare." "What about my house?" "We'll file an injunction to prevent the sale until this matter is resolved. If they've already listed it, we can have it removed from the market. Property can't be sold without the owner's consent unless there's a valid power of attorney or court order." For the first time in months, I felt hope. Real, practical hope, backed by legal expertise and a clear plan of action. "How long will this take?" "If everything goes smoothly, we could have you back in your own home within 6 weeks. But I need to warn you, your children won't give up easily. They've invested time, money, and their own financial planning in this arrangement. They're likely to fight back, possibly claiming you're not competent to make these decisions. Let them try, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. I've been competent enough to support them for 30 years. I think I can handle being competent enough to support myself. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen directed at me in months. Mrs. Chen, I think you're going to do just fine. Your children may have underestimated exactly who they're dealing with. As I walked back to Sunset Manor that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had since this nightmare began. The business card in my purse wasn't just contact information, it was a weapon, a tool, a key to the prison my children had built around me. They'd counted on me being passive, accepting, grateful for their intervention. Instead, they'd given me exactly the motivation I needed to fight back with everything I'd had. The nursing home petition started as a conversation in the common room about the poor quality of the evening meals. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that her son had promised the food would be restaurant quality when he'd toured the facility with her. Mr. Peterson complained that the activities program had been reduced despite no decrease in monthly fees. Mrs. Williams wondered aloud if there was anyone who actually advocated for residents versus just managing them. There should be, I said, looking up from the crossword puzzle I'd been pretending to work on. We're paying customers, not charity cases. We have rights. Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. In my day, when we had complaints about services, we organized. We didn't just accept what we were given. That comment sparked something. Within an hour, we had 8 residents gathered around the corner table, sharing stories of promises made during facility tours that had never been kept, of family members who'd stopped visiting once the paperwork was signed, of feeling powerless in a system designed to keep us compliant. What if we wrote a letter, suggested Mrs. Rodriguez, listed our concerns, presented solutions, demanded better treatment? Letters get filed, said Mr. Peterson grimly. We need something with more teeth. I thought about Margaret Williamson's advice about building a case that demonstrated competency and self-advocacy. What if we created a residence council, an official body that meets regularly, addresses concerns, and serves as a liaison with management? The idea energized the group. We spent the next week quietly recruiting residents who were still mentally sharp and frustrated with their treatment. Not everyone was interested, some had given up, others were afraid of rocking the boat, but we gathered 12 people who were ready to demand better. Our first official meeting was held in the library during afternoon activity time. I'd drafted a charter that established our purpose: to advocate for resident rights, improve quality of life, and ensure that our voices were heard in decisions that affected us. Mrs. Chen was elected president. Her 3 years of residence gave her credibility with both residents and staff. I became vice president, which positioned me to lead without attracting too much attention from administrators, who might see me as a troublemaker. We developed a list of reasonable demands: improved meal quality, expanded activity programs, better communication between staff and residents, and most importantly, clearer policies about resident rights and family involvement in care decisions. When we presented our petition to Administrator Reynolds, his response was exactly what I'd expected: polite dismissal wrapped in bureaucratic language about following established protocols and maintaining safety standards. But the real victory wasn't in his response, it was in the process itself. We'd demonstrated that we were organized, articulate, and capable of collective action. We'd created a formal structure that gave our complaints legitimacy. Most importantly, we'd shown that we weren't passive recipients of care but active participants in our own lives. Nurse Patricia was our secret weapon. She attended our meetings unofficially, providing insights into facility operations and staff perspectives. She helped us understand which battles were worth fighting and which were lost causes. The thing about places like this, she explained during one of our sessions, is that they depend on families being satisfied and residents being quiet. When residents start organizing, start demanding accountability, it creates problems for the business model. Activity Director James became another ally. He was genuinely committed to improving residents' lives and saw our council as a way to advocate for better programming and resources. He helped us schedule meetings, provided materials for our initiatives, and served as a bridge to staff members who were sympathetic but couldn't speak openly. Within a month, we'd established a regular meeting schedule, created subcommittees focused on different aspects of facility life, and begun documenting patterns of substandard care that affected multiple residents. We weren't just complaining, we were building a case for systemic change. The petition we drafted became our founding document, But more importantly, it became evidence of our competency and self-advocacy. Every resident who signed it, every meeting we held, every constructive suggestion we offered was proof that we were capable of making decisions about our own lives. My children's next visit was awkward in a way. It hadn't been before. They could see that I was different, more confident, more engaged, less willing to accept their explanations for why I needed to be there. "You seem more energetic," Sarah observed, clearly unsure whether this was good news or bad news. "I'm involved in resident advocacy now," I told her. "We're working to improve conditions here for everyone." David's jaw tightened. "Mom, you're not there to cause trouble. You're there to rest and recover." "I'm there because you put me there," I replied calmly. "But I'm not just going to sit quietly while I'm there." The look that passed between my 3 children was telling. They'd expected me to decline gradually, to become more dependent and easier to manage. Instead, I was becoming more independent and harder to control. The Residents' Council had given me something I hadn't expected: a community of people who understood what I was fighting for and why it mattered. Together, we were stronger than any of us had been alone. The revoked power of attorney document was beautifully simple, 3 pages that legally stripped my children of any authority to make decisions about my life, my finances, or my living situation. Margaret had prepared it perfectly, with notarization and witness signatures that made it unassailable in court. I chose to deliver it during Sunday dinner at David's house, the same setting where they'd tried to force me to sign away my independence. The irony was intentional. "I have something for each of you," I said, pulling the documents from my purse as we sat around the dining room table. They probably expected birthday cards or small gifts. I'd trained them over the years to expect my gestures of love to come with no strings attached. Instead, I handed each of them a copy of the revocation notice. David read his first, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then anger. "Mom, what is this?" "It's notice that I'm revoking any power of attorney arrangements we may have discussed. I'm also revoking the authorized user privileges on my bank accounts, and I'm terminating any automatic payments related to my current living situation." Sarah's voice was sharp with panic. "You can't do this. You're not thinking clearly. The stress of the facility, the adjustment period." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months," I interrupted. "Clear enough to know that you've been stealing from me." I pulled out the bank statements, the printed emails, the property tax assessment toll, the evidence I'd gathered over the past month. I spread them across David's dining room table like playing cards, each document representing another lie they'd told, another manipulation they'd attempted. "Stealing," Jennifer's voice was incredulous. "Mom, everything we've done has been for your own good. $50,000 in unauthorized withdrawals is for my own good. Planning to sell my house without my consent is for my own good. Placing me in assisted living so you can access my assets is for my own good." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, David tried to regain control of the conversation. "Mom, you're being manipulated by someone. This isn't like you. You've never been suspicious or accusatory. Someone at that place is filling your head with paranoid ideas. The only people who manipulated me are sitting at this table," I replied calmly, "and I have documentation to prove it." I pulled out my phone and showed them the recording app I'd been using. "Margaret Williamson, my attorney, suggested I document our conversations going forward. Legal protection, you understand." The word attorney hit them like a physical blow. They'd counted on me being isolated, confused, without resources or advocacy. The possibility that I'd hired legal representation clearly hadn't occurred to them. "You hired a lawyer." Sarah's voice was small, defeated. "I hired an elder law attorney who specializes in financial abuse cases. She's quite interested in your unauthorized access to my accounts, your attempts to sell my property, and your placement of me in assisted living for financial rather than medical reasons." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. We've been trying to help you, to keep you safe, to make sure you're cared for properly. And you're accusing us of what, exactly? Elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud." I let each word hang in the air, all of which are crimes in this state. Jennifer started crying the same manipulative tears she'd used as a child when caught doing something wrong. "Mom, how can you say that? We love you. Everything we've done has been because we love you. Love doesn't steal. Love doesn't lie." Love doesn't imprison someone in a care facility to access their assets. I stood up, gathering my documents. But control does all of those things. Where are you going? David demanded. Back to my room at Sunset Manor. For now. But not for much longer. Sarah grabbed my arm as I headed toward the door. Mom, please, can't we talk about this? Work something out. We never meant for you to feel. You never meant for me to find out. I corrected. There's a difference. I pulled my arm free and walked to the door. By the way, I've placed an injunction on the sale of my house. It can't be sold, listed, or transferred without a court order. I hope you haven't spent the money you were counting on receiving. The look of panic that crossed their faces told me everything I needed to know. They had been counting on that money desperately. My house sale wasn't just convenient for them, it was essential to their financial survival. Driving back to Sunset Manor in the taxi I'd called, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. Not the power I'd had as their mother when they were children. Not the power of someone who gave and gave until there was nothing left. This was different, the power of someone who'd finally learned to say no, who discovered that love without boundaries isn't love at all. The counterattack had begun, and they were already retreating. The new will and testament that Margaret drafted was 8 pages long and absolutely ruthless in its precision. Every dollar I'd spent on my children over the years, every sacrifice I'd made for their benefit, every cent they'd stolen from my, all of it was carefully accounted for and balanced against their inheritance. David, $127,000 in college expenses, $50,000 restaurant investment, $15,000 in various loans, never repaid. $8,000 in unauthorized account withdrawals, total $200,000 in lifetime parental investment. Inheritance, $0. Sarah, $89,000 in college expenses, $15,000 house down payment assistance, $12,000 in emergency financial help, $6,000 in unauthorized transfers, total $122,000 in lifetime parental investment. Inheritance, $0. Jennifer, $94,000 in college expenses, $28,000 wedding costs, $18,000 in various financial assistance, $4,000 in unauthorized transactions, total $144,000 in lifetime parental investment. Inheritance, $0. Instead, my estate would be divided between the Alzheimer's Association, the local food bank where I'd volunteered for years, and a scholarship fund for single mothers returning to college. People and organizations that understood the value of what I'd worked for, who wouldn't see my generosity as weakness or my resources as their entitlement. But the will was just the legal framework. The real reclaiming of my life began the day I walked out of Sunset Manor for good. I'd spent 6 weeks preparing for this moment. Margaret had secured a competency evaluation that conclusively demonstrated my mental and physical ability to live independently. We'd documented the financial fraud, filed complaints with Adult Protective Services, and prepared injunctions against any future unauthorized access to my assets. Most importantly, I'd arranged for the services I actually needed: a weekly housekeeper, grocery delivery, a medical alert system, and regular check-ins from a home health aide. Not because my children had been right about my needs, but because I was smart enough to acknowledge what support looked like versus what control looked like. The look on Administrator Reynolds' face when I presented my discharge papers was worth the entire ordeal. He'd clearly expected me to live out my days in room 247B, another compliant resident whose family had successfully warehoused their inconvenient elder. Mrs. Chen, are you certain this is wise? Your children expressed serious concerns about your ability to manage independently. My children expressed serious concerns about their ability to access my assets while I was managing independently. I corrected, there's a difference. Nurse Patricia helped me pack my few belongings, her smile warm with genuine happiness. I'm so proud of you, she whispered as we folded my clothes into the same suitcase I'd arrived with. You've given hope to every resident here who thought they were trapped. The Residents' Council threw me an impromptu farewell party in the common room. Mrs. Chen presented me with a card signed by everyone. To our inspiration. You showed us that fighting back is possible at any age. But the most satisfying moment came when I walked into my own house for the first time in 3 months. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My children hadn't dared to remove anything else after I'd filed the injunction. The familiar smell of my kitchen, the comfortable weight of my favorite chair, The view from my bedroom window of the garden I'd tended for 20 years. This was home. Not a room assigned by strangers, not a place chosen by people who'd stopped seeing me as a person. This was mine, earned through decades of work, maintained through years of sacrifice, and defended when it mattered most. My children's attempts at reconciliation began within hours of my return. David showed up first, probably hoping to catch me before I'd fully settled in, before my resolve had solidified. "Mom, we need to talk. This whole situation has gotten out of hand, has it?" I asked, not inviting him in. "I'm back in my own home, managing my own finances, making my own decisions about my life. Seems pretty well in hand to me. You can't just cut us out of your life because you're angry. We're family. Family doesn't steal from each other. David, family doesn't lie to manipulate each other into giving up their independence. Family doesn't treat each other like problems to be solved or assets to be liquidated." He tried the guilt approach next. "After everything we've been through together, all the love and support we've shared, you're going to throw that away over money." "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied calmly. "I'm simply recognizing what you threw away when you decided my bank account was more important than my autonomy." Sarah and Jennifer arrived together the next day, clearly having coordinated their approach. More tears, more manipulation, more attempts to reframe their theft as love and their control as concern. But I'd learned something important during my time at Sunset Manor. I didn't owe them my forgiveness just because they were my children. I didn't owe them access to my resources just because I'd provided for them in the past. I didn't owe them anything except the truth about what they'd done and the consequences of their choices. The new will was just the beginning. I changed the locks on my house. I moved my banking to a different institution. I established a trust that would prevent anyone from making financial decisions on my behalf without explicit court approval. Most importantly, I reclaimed my sense of self-worth. For the first time in decades, my value wasn't measured by what I could provide for my children but by what I could provide for myself and for causes that mattered to me. Lina Chen, 68, was no longer anyone's problem to be managed. She was a woman who'd learned the difference between love and exploitation, between family and users, between caring for someone and controlling them, and she was just getting started. The charity donation receipts arrived in my mailbox like small acts of revolution. $25,000 to the Alzheimer's Association in memory of Mrs. Rodriguez's husband. $15,000 to the local food bank that had fed families like mine when Robert first left. $30,000 to establish the Lina Chen Scholarship for single mothers pursuing college degrees. Each donation was money my children had expected to inherit, resources they'd planned to use for their own financial recovery. Instead, I was investing in people and causes that understood the difference between need and greed, between support and exploitation. The final confrontations came separately, as I'd planned. I wanted to face each of my children individually, to make sure they understood exactly what they'd lost and why. David arrived on a Tuesday evening, his face haggard with stress. His second business venture had failed completely, the one he'd started with money borrowed against the assumption that my house would soon be available to cover his debts. "Mom, I'm in serious trouble," he began without preamble. "The creditors are threatening bankruptcy. I need help." "You need help," I repeated, settling into my favorite chair. "The same way I needed help when you were struggling in college. The same way I needed help when your restaurant was failing. That's different. You were my mother. It was your job to help me. And you were my son. It was your job to love me, not use me." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared for this conversation, copies of every check I'd written for him over the years, every loan that had never been repaid, every sacrifice I'd made for his benefit. 37 years of help, David. $250,000 in education, business investments, bailouts, and outright gifts. When was the last time you helped me with anything that didn't ultimately benefit you? He couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. Every interaction we'd had in recent years had been transactional, him asking for something, me providing it, both of us pretending it was normal family dynamics. "I've given everything I'm going to give," I continued. "The rest of my resources are going to people who understand that help flows both ways, that love doesn't come with a price tag, that gratitude isn't just a word you use when you need something else." Sarah's visit came 2 days later. She'd been crying before she even reached my door. Her marriage was struggling under the financial pressure. Mike was working 2 jobs to cover their mortgage, and they were facing foreclosure on the house I'd helped them buy. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she sobbed. "We made mistakes, but we were trying to take care of you. We were scared about you living alone, worried about your health, concerned about your safety." "You were concerned about your debt," I corrected. "You were scared about your own financial problems. You were worried about how to access my assets without looking like the selfish adults you'd become." I showed her the emails I'd printed, the ones where she discussed using my house sale to pay off her own debts. "This isn't about taking care of me, Sarah. This is about taking care of yourselves at my expense. But we love you. You love what I can provide. There's a difference." Jennifer's confrontation was the hardest because she'd been my baby, the one I'd protected most fiercely, the one whose wedding had cost me my entire savings account. She came with Marcus, both of them looking desperate and defeated. Their student loans were crushing them, their entry-level jobs barely covered their basic expenses, and they'd been counting on my eventual inheritance to buy their first home. "Mom, I know we handled things wrong," Jennifer admitted, "but we never meant to hurt you. We thought the nursing home would be good for you, companionship, activities, medical care available. We thought you'd be happier." "You thought you'd be happier," I said gently. "You thought it would be easier to visit me occasionally than to actually be involved in my life. You thought my house money would solve your financial problems while keeping your consciences clear." Marcus spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Chen, we're drowning in debt. We can't afford to get married, buy a house, start a family. We just need help getting on our feet." "I helped Jennifer get on her feet for 23 years, I replied. "I paid for her education, her wedding, her emergencies, her dreams. When does the helping stop being my responsibility and start being hers?" The truth was devastating in its simplicity. I had raised 3 children who saw me as a resource rather than a person, who measured my love by my willingness to sacrifice my own security for their convenience. But the confrontations weren't about punishments, they were about clarity. I needed them to understand that their actions had consequences, that relationships built on exploitation inevitably collapse when the exploitation is exposed. "I'm not cutting you out of my life because I'm angry," I explained to each of them. "I'm establishing boundaries that should have existed years ago. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it will be based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and reciprocal care, not on what I can provide for you." The charity donations were my answer to their years of financial manipulation. Instead of funding their poor choices and sense of entitlement, my money would help people who understood struggle, who appreciated assistance, who wouldn't see generosity as weakness. Every receipt that arrived in my mailbox was proof that my resources could make a real difference in the world, when they weren't being wasted on people who took them for granted. The reckoning wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And justice, I'd learned, sometimes looks like saying no to the people who've never heard that word from you before. The volunteer schedule on my refrigerator tells the story of my new life better than any diary could. Mondays at the food bank, sorting donations and helping families choose groceries with dignity. Tuesdays at the community college, mentoring single mothers through the scholarship program I'd established. Wednesdays at the senior center, leading workshops on financial literacy and elder rights. Thursdays, visiting Sunset Manor, not as a resident but as an advocate for people still trapped in situations they never chose. This is what purpose looks like when it's chosen rather than imposed, when it's driven by passion rather than obligation. The call from Margaret Williamson came on a Friday morning, 6 months after I'd reclaimed my independence. "Lina, I have news about your case. Adult Protective Services has completed their investigation into the financial abuse allegations. My children were facing formal charges, not just for the unauthorized access to my accounts, that was civil fraud, but for their systematic manipulation and exploitation of an elderly person, which was a criminal offense in our state. They want to make an example of this case," Margaret explained. "Adult children who exploit their parents financially have been getting away with it for too long. Your documentation was so thorough, your case so clear-cut, that the prosecutor sees it as an opportunity to send a message. I felt no satisfaction in their legal troubles, only a deep sadness that it had come to this. But consequences, I'd learned, were sometimes the only way people understood the seriousness of their actions. The real victory wasn't in their punishment, it was in the community I'd built around my new life, the scholarship recipients who sent me updates about their progress, the food bank clients who'd found stable employment with help from our job training program, the Sunset Manor residents who'd successfully advocated for better conditions using strategies I'd helped develop. Mrs. Chen had become the facility's official ombudsman, a paid position that gave her authority to investigate complaints and advocate for resident rights. Mr. Peterson had moved back to his own apartment, with support services that allowed him to maintain his independence. Mrs. Rodriguez had reconciled with her son on her terms, with clear boundaries about her financial autonomy. We'd created a network of people who understood that aging didn't mean surrendering control, that needing help didn't mean accepting exploitation, that family obligations worked both ways. My relationship with my children evolved slowly and awkwardly. David eventually filed for bankruptcy and moved back in with his ex-wife, finally accepting that his business dreams had been funded by my sacrifices rather than his abilities. He called occasionally, conversations that were stilted but honestly, we're learning to relate to each other without money, as the underlying dynamic. Sarah and Mike managed to avoid foreclosure by downsizing to a smaller house and taking responsibility for their own financial decisions. She visited monthly, bringing small gifts that clearly strained her budget, but demonstrated an understanding that giving should be reciprocal. Jennifer and Marcus postponed their wedding plans and focused on paying down their student loans. She wrote me letters, actual handwritten letters apologizing, not just for the financial abuse, but for the years of taking my generosity for granted. Her words showed a maturity I'd never seen before, a recognition that love required more than just receiving. The conversations were different now. Instead of immediately asking for help when they called, they asked about my volunteer work, my health, my interests. Instead of assuming I'd solve their problems, they shared their struggles and asked for advice rather than money. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before, that had been built on unhealthy patterns that needed to be broken. But it might eventually become something better, a connection between equals who chose to love each other, rather than people trapped in roles that bred resentment. The house felt different too, still mine, still familiar, but lighter somehow. The financial stress that had shadowed every decision was gone. The constant worry about my children's crises had been replaced by concern for people who appreciated help rather than demanding it. I decorated the guest room not for my children, who would need to earn the privilege of staying in my home, but for the out-of-town family members of Sunset Manor residents, people who wanted to be close during difficult transitions. My garden flourished under careful attention. I finally had time to provide. The kitchen hosted dinner parties for my volunteer colleagues, women my age who'd found purpose and community in service rather than sacrifice. At 70. I discovered what I'd never had time to learn in the decades of raising children and supporting ungrateful adults. I was interesting, capable, and valuable, independent of what I could provide for other people. The volunteer schedule on my refrigerator represented more than just activities. It was evidence of a life lived on my own terms, relationships built on mutual respect, and resources used to make a real difference in the world. Lina Chen, no longer anyone's burden or ATM, had finally learned the most important lesson of all. The people who truly deserve your love are the ones who love you back, not the ones who see you as a means to an end. And sometimes, the quietest revolution really is the most devastating one, especially when it's fought by a woman who's spent 70 years learning exactly how to win.